Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Deadwood history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1856, the Black Hills of Dakota Territory drew thousands of men westward with promises of gold dust thick as flour and nuggets large as robin's eggs. Deadwood Gulch had swollen from a seasonal camp to a sprawling settlement of canvas tents, hastily built saloons, and merchant stalls that stretched along the muddy main thoroughfare. Among the establishments that catered to miners, flush with newly found wealth, was Murphy's Palace, a two-story wooden structure with a false front that made it appear grander than the cramped quarters within. Clara May Dunning arrived in Deadwood during the second week of April, 1856, aboard a freight wagon carrying supplies from Cheyenne. She was 24 years old, with auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and carried herself with the careful posture of a woman who had learned to navigate the attention of men without encouraging it. The wagon driver who brought her to town later told others that she spoke little during the three-day journey, kept her belongings in a single worn carpet bag, and paid her fare with coins so new they caught sunlight like mirrors. Murphy's Palace employed 6 women who served drinks, dealt cards, and provided companionship to miners who had struck modest claims or were spending their last dust before heading back to failed diggings. Clara May took a room on the second floor, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed and washstand, with thin walls that carried every conversation from the adjacent rooms. The window faced east toward the gulch, where hydraulic operations ran day and night, filling the air with the constant sound of rushing water and falling gravel. She began working the main floor of Murphy's Palace within days of her arrival, serving whiskey and beer to men who tracked mud and gold dust across the rough-hewn planks. Clara May wore the same dress each night, a dark blue wool garment with long sleeves and a high collar that set her apart from the other women who favored lower necklines and brighter colors designed to catch lamplight. Around her waist, she tied a large canvas apron with deep pockets that she used to collect tips and carry the small items necessary for her work. The other women at Murphy's Palace found Clara May's demeanor puzzling. She spoke when spoken to, performed her duties without complaint, but never joined the casual conversations that filled the quiet moments between customers. When asked about her past, she would mention only that she had come west from Missouri and had family she preferred not to discuss. Margaret Ellis, who had worked at Murphy's for 2 years, later recalled that Clara May seemed to be listening for something that the rest of them could not hear. Boyd Carver served as Deadwood Sheriff, a position that carried more responsibility for keeping peace between drunk miners than enforcing territorial law. He was 38 years old, had served as a deputy in Colorado mining camps before accepting the appointment in Deadwood, and understood that his authority depended more on the respect of the community than on any legal mandate from distant territorial offices. Carver made regular rounds through the saloons and gambling halls, not to arrest patrons for minor offenses, but to ensure that disputes remained manageable and that business owners felt secure in their investments. During his evening visits to Murphy's Palace, Sheriff Carver noticed Clara May's unusual behavior around money. While other women would count their tips openly and discuss their earnings with casual interest, Clara May handled coins with particular attention, examining each piece before placing it in her apron pocket. She would hold gold dust up to the lamplight, testing its color and weight in her palm before securing it in a small leather pouch she kept tied to her wrist. When customers paid with nuggets, she would study the surface and texture with the focus of someone who understood variations in ore quality. The spring of 1856 brought unusually heavy rainfall to the Black Hills. The constant downpour turned Deadwood streets into rivers of mud that reached wagon wheel height and made movement between buildings treacherous. Business at Murphy's Palace slowed as miners found travel from their claims difficult, and the women who worked there began to worry about their ability to earn enough to pay room and board. Clara May, however, seemed unaffected by the economic slowdown. She continued to work her regular hours, and when asked how she managed to maintain her income during the lean period, she would only say that patience was often rewarded. On the evening of May 15th, 1856, a miner named Thomas Whitmore arrived at Murphy's Palace carrying a leather satchel that he claimed contained the largest single nugget found in Deadwood Gulch that season. Whitmore had struck a rich vein in his claim upstream from the main diggings and had spent 3 days carefully extracting a piece of gold ore that weighed nearly 4 pounds. He displayed the nugget on the bar, allowing patrons to examine the specimen while he celebrated with drinks purchased for anyone willing to listen to his account of the discovery. Clara May approached Whitmore's table near midnight, when the crowd had thinned and most patrons had returned to their tents or boarding houses. She studied the nugget with her usual careful attention, holding it close to the oil lamp and running her fingers across its surface. Whitmore, who had consumed considerable whiskey during his celebration, began describing the location of his claim in detail, mentioning landmarks and geographic features that would allow someone to locate the site. Clara May listened without comment, occasionally asking questions about the depth of the vein and the quality of surrounding ore. When Whitmore left Murphy's Palace near 2 in the morning, he carried his satchel with the same care he had shown throughout the evening. Clara May finished her duties, cleaned her station, and retired to her room as was her custom. The next morning, Whitmore's body was discovered by a freight wagon driver approximately 3 miles southeast of Deadwood, near a creek crossing on the trail that led toward his claim. He had been struck in the head with a heavy object, and his satchel was missing along with a money belt that other miners confirmed he had worn beneath his coat. Sheriff Carver began his investigation by interviewing everyone who had seen Whitmore at Murphy's Palace the previous evening. The testimony provided a clear timeline of the miner's activities and confirmed that he had left the establishment alone, carrying his satchel and appearing steady enough to travel safely. Several witnesses mentioned Clara May's extended conversation with Whitmore, noting that she had shown unusual interest in his nugget and had asked specific questions about his claim. When questioned, Clara May stated that she had been curious about the specimen but had no knowledge of Whitmore's plans after leaving the saloon. The investigation continued for 2 weeks without significant progress. Sheriff Carver searched the area around Whitmore's body for evidence but found no traces of the missing satchel or money belt. He interviewed other miners who worked claims near Whitmore's site, but none reported seeing strangers in the area or hearing sounds that might indicate violence. The case began to seem like one of many robberies that occurred along isolated trails, committed by someone who understood the value of what Whitmore carried and had followed him from town. On June 3rd, 1856, Clara May failed to appear for her evening shift at Murphy's Palace. Murphy himself went to her room and found the door unlocked and her belongings gone. The only items remaining were a few pieces of clothing too worn to be worth packing and a small hand mirror with a cracked handle. The other women who worked at the establishment said Clara May had given no indication that she planned to leave, had not mentioned travel plans, and had seemed to be conducting business as usual during her final days in Deadwood. Sheriff Carver searched Clara May's abandoned room and discovered evidence that suggested her departure had been planned rather than sudden. Scratches on the wooden floor indicated that furniture had been moved recently, and examination of the floorboards revealed that several had been pried up and replaced. When Carver removed the boards, he found a shallow cavity that had been carved into the supporting beam beneath. The space was empty, but the walls of the cavity showed gouges and scrapes that suggested it had been used to store metal objects. The discovery prompted Carver to investigate Clara May's financial activities more thoroughly. He spoke with merchants who had sold her supplies, the boarding house operator who had collected her room payments, and other business owners who might have handled her money. The investigation revealed that Clara May had been converting her earnings into gold coins and dust with unusual frequency, often exchanging paper currency and silver for gold at rates that seemed to favor the seller rather than her own financial interest. Further investigation into Clara May's behavior during her time in Deadwood revealed patterns that had not seemed significant to individual observers, but formed a troubling picture when examined together. She had been seen walking along the trails that led to various mining claims, often during daylight hours when she was not scheduled to work. Several miners reported encounters with a woman matching her description near their diggings, always at a distance and never approaching close enough for conversation. When these sightings were mapped according to date and location, they corresponded to areas where successful claims had been recently established or where significant discoveries had been reported. A freight wagon driver named Samuel Morrison provided testimony that proved crucial to understanding Clara May's activities. Morrison transported supplies between Deadwood and the smaller camps that had developed around successful diggings, and his routes took him along many of the trails where Clara May had been spotted. He recalled seeing her near Foster Creek on May 10th, 5 days before Whitmore's murder, examining the ground near a crossing where miners often rested during travel between their claims and town. Morrison noted her behavior as unusual because she appeared to be studying the trail itself rather than panning for gold or collecting specimens. The search for Clara May expanded beyond Deadwood, as Sheriff Carver contacted law enforcement officials in other mining settlements throughout Dakota Territory and neighboring regions. Telegraph messages were sent to sheriffs in Rapid City, Custer, and Lead, describing Clara May's appearance and requesting information about any woman matching her description who had recently arrived in their jurisdictions. The responses provided no immediate leads, but they established a network of communication that would prove important in the following months. In late June 1856, a stagecoach robbery occurred 40 miles south of Deadwood near the territorial border. The attack followed a pattern that had become familiar to law enforcement officials. A lone traveler carrying valuable cargo was ambushed on an isolated stretch of road, killed with a single blow to the head and robbed of everything valuable. The victim was a merchant named Henry Caldwell, who had been transporting a strongbox containing gold coins intended for deposit in a bank in Cheyenne. The strongbox was missing, and Caldwell's personal effects had been searched thoroughly. Sheriff Carver traveled to the scene of the Caldwell robbery and found evidence that suggested similarities to the Whitmore case. The location of the attack indicated knowledge of the merchant's route and timing, suggesting that someone had observed his departure from Deadwood and followed him to a suitable ambush point. The method of killing was identical, and the thoroughness of the robbery indicated someone who understood the value of different types of cargo and knew how to search for hidden valuables. During his investigation of the Caldwell case, Carver interviewed passengers who had traveled on the same stagecoach route during the previous week. A woman traveling from Deadwood to visit family in Nebraska recalled seeing another female passenger who had boarded the stage at a way station between Deadwood and the territorial border. The passenger had carried minimal luggage but wore a heavy coat despite warm weather, and had seemed nervous about other travelers' conversations regarding valuable cargo being transported in the area. The description provided by the Nebraska-bound traveler matched Clara May's appearance closely enough to warrant further investigation. Sheriff Carver returned to Deadwood and began examining records of stagecoach departures and passenger manifests from the weeks following Clara May's disappearance. The records were incomplete, as many way stations operated informally and did not maintain detailed logs. But several operators recalled a woman traveling alone who had paid her fare with gold coins and had requested to be dropped at locations between regular stops. On July 20th, 1856, Sheriff Carver received a telegraph message from a deputy sheriff in Wyoming Territory reporting a suspicious death near a mining camp called Bitter Creek. The victim was a prospector named William Hayes, who had been found dead beside a trail leading from his claim to the nearest settlement. Hayes had been killed in the same manner as Whitmore and Caldwell, and his personal effects had been thoroughly searched. Local authorities had arrested a woman found camping nearby, who could not adequately explain her presence in the area or account for the gold coins and dust found in her possession. Carver traveled to Wyoming Territory to interview the arrested woman, a journey that required 3 days by horseback across difficult terrain. When he arrived at the Bitter Creek jail, he immediately recognized Clara May Dunning, despite changes in her appearance that suggested weeks of outdoor living. She had cut her auburn hair short and dyed it black with what appeared to be walnut hulls, and her skin was darkened by sun exposure and dirt. The careful posture and modest demeanor that had characterized her behavior in Deadwood had been replaced by the wary alertness of someone who had been living as a fugitive. The interview with Clara May provided few answers to the questions that had accumulated during the investigation. She acknowledged her identity and admitted to leaving Deadwood without notice, but claimed that her departure had been motivated by a desire to avoid an unspecified threat rather than to escape justice. When questioned about the deaths of Whitmore, Caldwell, and Hayes, she maintained that she had no knowledge of the crimes and that any similarities in timing or location were coincidental. The gold found in her possession, she explained, represented savings from her work at Murphy's Palace and subsequent employment at mining camps along her travel route. The evidence against Clara May was circumstantial but substantial. Her presence near the scenes of 3 similar murders, her unusual interest in the financial activities of victims, and her possession of gold that she could not adequately account for created a pattern that satisfied Wyoming Territory authorities. However, the investigation revealed additional aspects of her behavior that suggested a level of planning and knowledge that extended beyond opportunistic robbery. Among Clara May's belongings, authorities found a small leather-bound notebook containing detailed observations about mining activities, trail conditions, and the habits of individual prospectors. The entries were written in a careful script and organized by date and location, suggesting systematic surveillance rather than casual observation. Several entries described the daily routines of men who were later murdered, including notes about when they traveled to town, how they transported their gold, and whether they carried weapons for protection. The notebook also contained sketches of various trails and landmarks around Deadwood and other mining camps, with particular attention to locations suitable for ambush. The drawings showed an understanding of terrain that would allow someone to observe travelers without being seen and to escape quickly after an attack. Some sketches included detailed measurements of distances between cover points and notes about the time required to travel between different positions. Perhaps most disturbing was a section of the notebook devoted to what appeared to be financial calculations related to the value of different types of gold ore and the current exchange rates in various settlements. Clara May had recorded information about which merchants offered the best prices for raw gold, which banks asked the fewest questions about large deposits, and which transportation routes were least likely to attract attention from law enforcement officials. The trial of Clara May Dunning began in September 1856 in the Territorial Court at Cheyenne. The prosecution presented evidence linking her to 3 murders, and argued that she had developed a systematic method for identifying wealthy travelers, tracking their movements, and robbing them at isolated locations. The defense maintained that the evidence was circumstantial and that Clara May's presence near the crime scenes could be explained by her legitimate travel between mining camps in search of employment. Testimony during the trial revealed additional details about Clara May's background that had not emerged during her time in Deadwood. A witness from Missouri testified that she had been married to a man named Robert Dunning, who had died in a mining accident in 1854. Following her husband's death, Clara May had attempted to maintain his claim, but had been forced to sell it at a significant loss when she could not continue the heavy labor required for mining operations. The witness described Clara May's financial situation after her husband's death as desperate. She had been left with debts that exceeded the value of the mining claim, and her attempts to find employment in Missouri had been unsuccessful. Her decision to travel west, according to this testimony, had been motivated by the belief that mining camps offered opportunities for women to earn money that were not available in more settled communities. During cross-examination, Clara May's defense attorney attempted to present her actions as those of a widow trying to survive in a harsh environment rather than a calculating criminal. The attorney argued that her notebook represented the careful observations of someone trying to understand an unfamiliar industry, not evidence of criminal planning. The financial calculations, he suggested, were the result of her determination to avoid the poverty that had followed her husband's death. The prosecution countered by presenting testimony from Sheriff Carver and other witnesses that demonstrated Clara May's behavior went beyond normal business interests. Her systematic observation of specific individuals, her knowledge of their travel patterns, and her presence near multiple crime scenes suggested a level of premeditation that could not be explained as coincidence or survival instinct. On October 15, 1856, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of murder and robbery. Clara May Dunning was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that reflected the territorial court's determination to demonstrate that crimes against travelers would be punished severely. The sentence was scheduled to be carried out in November 1856, following the customary period for appeals and final preparations. However, Clara May Dunning never faced execution. On the morning of November 2, 1856, guards at the Cheyenne jail discovered that she had died during the night, under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but several witnesses noted that Clara May had appeared healthy during evening rounds and had given no indication of illness or distress. An examination of Clara May's cell revealed that she had spent her final hours writing what appeared to be a confession, although the document was incomplete and largely illegible. The few passages that could be deciphered suggested that she had indeed committed the murders attributed to her, but also hinted at additional crimes that had not been discovered. References to the others who sleep beneath stone and gold that calls from shallow graves implied that the investigation had uncovered only a portion of her activities. The incomplete confession also contained passages that seemed to describe Clara May's mental state during the months she had spent as a fugitive. She wrote about hearing voices that guided her toward wealthy travelers and about dreams in which her dead husband instructed her to collect gold for their reunion in the afterlife. Whether these passages reflected genuine psychological disturbance or represented an attempt to establish grounds for an insanity defense was never determined. Following Clara May's death, Sheriff Carver organized a more extensive search for evidence of additional crimes. Teams of deputies and volunteers examined areas around Deadwood and other mining camps where Clara May was known to have traveled, looking for signs of hidden graves or cached valuables. The search continued through the winter of 1856 and into the spring of 1857, but produced no significant discoveries. The case of Clara May Dunning became a cautionary tale told throughout mining camps across the American West. The story served as a reminder that the isolation and wealth associated with gold mining created opportunities for predators who understood how to exploit the trust and carelessness of successful prospectors. Sheriff Carver used the case as the basis for warnings about traveling alone with valuable cargo and the importance of varying routes and schedules to avoid predictable patterns. In the years following Clara May's death, several other cases emerged that bore similarities to her method of operation. Women traveling alone through mining regions would be arrested on suspicion of robbery or murder, but investigations rarely produced the level of evidence that had been available in Clara May's case. Whether these suspects were imitators inspired by her story or independent criminals who had developed similar techniques was never established with certainty. The Murphy's Palace continued operating in Deadwood until 1859, when declining gold yields led to a reduction in the settlement's population. The building was eventually sold to a merchant who converted it into a general store, and the second-floor rooms where Clara May had lived became storage space for inventory. By 1860, most traces of the original saloon had been removed, and few residents remembered the details of the case that had once dominated local conversations. Sheriff Boyd Carver served in Deadwood until 1858, when he accepted a position with territorial law enforcement in Montana. His final report on the Clara May Dunning case was filed with territorial authorities in Cheyenne and became part of the official record of criminal activity in Dakota Territory during the Gold Rush period. Carver noted in his report that the case demonstrated the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies in different territories and more systematic approaches to tracking criminals who moved between mining settlements. The personal effects that Clara May had left behind in her room at Murphy's Palace were eventually sold to pay for her burial expenses and the costs associated with returning her body to Missouri for interment beside her husband. Among these items was a small daguerreotype photograph showing Clara May and Robert Dunning posed beside mining equipment, both wearing the serious expressions typical of formal photography during that period. The photograph was purchased by a local collector who later donated it to the Territorial Historical Society. Years after the case was closed, occasional rumors surfaced about caches of gold that Clara May had supposedly hidden during her time as a fugitive. Treasure hunters would arrive in Deadwood claiming to have maps or information that would lead to buried valuables, but none of these searches produced any discoveries. The rumors became part of local folklore, joining other stories about lost mines and hidden wealth that were common throughout the Black Hills region. In 1867, more than 10 years after Clara May's death, workers renovating the building that had housed Murphy's Palace discovered a small metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been her room. The box contained approximately $200 in gold coins, several pieces of jewelry, and a letter written in Clara May's handwriting. The letter was addressed to "Whoever finds this," and contained instructions for using the money to purchase a proper headstone for her grave in Missouri. The letter also included an apology to the families of the men she had killed, acknowledging that her actions had been motivated by greed rather than desperation. She wrote that the gold in the box represented money she had earned legitimately during her time in Deadwood, and wanted to ensure that it was used for a constructive purpose rather than adding to the wealth she had stolen from others. The letter concluded with a request that anyone reading it should pray for forgiveness for all those who had died violently in pursuit of gold. The discovery of the hidden box was reported in the Deadwood newspaper, which by then was serving a much smaller community than had existed during the height of the gold rush. The article generated renewed interest in the Clara May Dunning case, and several older residents provided interviews sharing their memories of the woman who had briefly worked at Murphy's Palace. Most remembered her as quiet and unremarkable, making her later crimes seem even more shocking in retrospect. The money found in Clara May's hidden cache was indeed used to purchase a headstone for her grave in Missouri, as she had requested. The stone was simple granite with her name, dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved wife of Robert Dunning." No mention was made of her crimes or the circumstances of her death. The remainder of the money was donated to a fund that provided assistance to widows of miners who had died in accidents. As Deadwood evolved from a boomtown to a more permanent settlement, the story of Clara May Dunning became part of the community's historical narrative. Local historians preserved records of the case, including Sheriff Carver's reports and court documents from her trial. These materials became important sources for understanding the social and economic conditions that had existed during the early years of gold mining in the Black Hills. The case also influenced law enforcement practices throughout the mining regions of the American West. Sheriff Carver's recommendations for improved communication between agencies led to the establishment of more systematic methods for tracking criminals who moved between territories. The techniques that Clara May had used to identify and follow wealthy travelers became part of training materials used to educate law enforcement officers about patterns of criminal behavior in mining communities. In later years, the story of Clara May Dunning was often cited as an example of how the pursuit of wealth could corrupt individuals who might otherwise have lived honest lives. Social reformers used her case to argue for better support systems for widows and other vulnerable members of mining communities, suggesting that preventing desperate circumstances might reduce the likelihood of criminal behavior. The building that had housed Murphy's Palace changed hands several more times before being demolished in 1873 to make way for a new commercial development. During the demolition, workers discovered additional evidence of the building's past, including personal items that had belonged to various people who had lived or worked there. None of these discoveries was directly related to Clara May Dunning, but they served as reminders of the transient nature of life in early mining settlements. By 1875, most of the original residents of Deadwood's gold rush period had moved on to other opportunities or had died from various causes related to the harsh conditions of frontier life. The few who remained often gathered to share memories of the community's early years, and the story of Clara May Dunning was frequently part of these conversations. Each telling added new details or interpretations, gradually transforming the factual record into something more resembling legend. The Clara May Dunning case was eventually included in books about crime in the American West, where it was presented as an example of how the lawlessness and isolation of mining communities could provide cover for criminal activity. These accounts often emphasize the sensational aspects of her crimes, while paying less attention to the economic and social factors that had contributed to her situation as a struggling widow in a male-dominated environment. Modern historians who have studied the case have noted that Clara May's methods demonstrated a level of intelligence and planning that contradicted contemporary assumptions about women's roles and capabilities. Her systematic approach to identifying targets, gathering information, and executing robberies required skills that were typically associated with male criminals during that period. This aspect of the case has made it of particular interest to scholars studying gender roles in frontier society. The incomplete confession that Clara May wrote during her final night in jail has been analyzed by historians and criminologists seeking to understand her motivations and mental state. While the document's authenticity has never been questioned, Its fragmented nature and cryptic references to other crimes have led to various interpretations about the full extent of her criminal activities. Some scholars believe that she may have been responsible for as many as a dozen murders, while others argue that her references to additional crimes were the product of guilt and psychological disturbance rather than factual admissions. The location of Clara May Dunning's final resting place in Missouri became a minor pilgrimage site for people interested in frontier crime stories. Visitors would leave coins on her headstone, following a tradition associated with honoring the dead, though the practice seemed ironic, given that her crimes had been motivated by the pursuit of gold. Cemetery officials eventually discouraged this practice due to concerns about encouraging unhealthy fascination with criminal figures. In 1896, 40 years after Clara May's death, the Territorial Historical Society organized an exhibition about crime and law enforcement during the Gold Rush period. The Clara May Dunning case was featured prominently, with displays including photographs of evidence, copies of court documents, and reconstructions of scenes from her trial. The exhibition attracted significant public interest and contributed to the case's continued presence in popular memory. The exhibition also included artifacts that had belonged to Clara May's victims, including personal items from Thomas Whitmore, Henry Caldwell, and William Hayes. These displays were intended to remind visitors that her crimes had caused real suffering for individuals and families, not just abstract legal violations. Letters from family members describing their losses were included to provide human context for the criminal charges. As the 20th century approached, the story of Clara May Dunning continued to be retold in various forms, including dime novels and newspaper serializations that took considerable liberties with the factual record. These popular versions often portrayed her as either a romantic figure driven to crime by tragic circumstances or as a purely evil character motivated by insatiable greed. Neither characterization reflected the complex reality of her case, as documented in court records and law enforcement reports. The Clara May Dunning case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of serial murder during the American Gold Rush period. The survival of Sheriff Carver's investigation records, court transcripts, and contemporary newspaper accounts provides researchers with an unusually complete picture of how such crimes were investigated and prosecuted in frontier communities. The case continues to be studied by historians, criminologists, and legal scholars interested in understanding the intersection of law enforcement, economic opportunity, and social instability in 19th century America. Today, visitors to modern Deadwood can still walk along the approximate route of the original Main Street where Murphy's Palace once operated. Historical markers throughout the town describe various aspects of the Gold Rush period, including brief references to notable crimes and law enforcement challenges. The Clara May Dunning case is mentioned in some of these displays, though usually as part of broader discussions about the difficulties of maintaining order in rapidly growing mining communities. The legacy of Clara May Dunning's crimes extends beyond their immediate impact on the victims and their families. The case influenced law enforcement practices, contributed to public discussions about crime and punishment, and became part of the folklore surrounding the American frontier experience. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of gold fever or as evidence of the desperate measures people would take to escape poverty, the story continues to provoke questions about justice, survival, and moral responsibility in extreme circumstances. In the archives of various historical societies throughout the American West, researchers can still examine the original documents related to the Clara May Dunning case. These materials provide insight not only into her specific crimes, but also into the broader social and economic conditions that shaped life in mining communities during the 1850s. The careful preservation of these records ensures that future generations will be able to study this case as part of their efforts to understand the complex history of American expansion and settlement. The final chapter in the story of Clara May Dunning may have been written with her death in the Cheyenne jail, but the questions raised by her case continue to resonate. How many other crimes went undetected in the chaos of gold rush settlements? What drove a seemingly ordinary woman to become a calculating killer? And what might have been different if the economic and social support systems available to widows and other vulnerable people had been stronger during that period? These questions remain relevant today as communities continue to grapple with the relationship between economic desperation and criminal behavior. The story of Clara May Dunning serves as a reminder that behind every crime statistic is a human being whose actions were shaped by a complex combination of personal choices, social circumstances, and historical conditions that may be difficult to fully understand from the perspective of later generations. Until today, nobody knows what really happened during those final hours in the Cheyenne jail cell, or whether Clara May Dunning took additional secrets with her to the grave.